On Thanksgiving night, my 9-year-old daughter opened a beautifully wrapped gift from my mother. It was completely empty. As my mother and sister laughed, calling us worthless takers, my daughter wiped a single tear, smiled, and handed my mother a small velvet box. What was inside that box did not just end our holiday dinner, it ended my family's entire fake empire. My name is Cassidy, 34 years old, and for years my family thought I was a struggling, worthless single mother. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your worth. The dining room of my brother-in-law Jamal and my sister Brittany's Connecticut mansion was suffocatingly warm, smelling of expensive sage stuffing and roasted turkey. The long mahogany table was set with heavy crystal glasses, polished silver, and a centerpiece of imported white roses that probably cost more than my supposed monthly grocery budget. I sat quietly near the end of the table, cutting a piece of dry turkey, wearing a simple beige dress I had bought years ago. Beside me sat my daughter Mia, swinging her legs in her little velvet holiday dress, her eyes bright with the innocent joy of being around family. Across from us, Jamal leaned back in his custom-tailored suit, swirling a glass of $200 Cabernet. He played the part of the elite Silicon Valley tech bro, flawlessly, always talking about his latest startup venture and his leased Tesla, parked in the circular driveway. Next to him, Brittany adjusted her heavy diamond necklace, her perfectly blown-out hair catching the light of the massive chandelier above us. She played the wealthy suburban socialite to perfection. And at the head of the table sat my mother, Patricia, holding court over her golden child and her successful son-in-law, casting glances of absolute disdain in my direction. They thought I was a low-level data entry clerk. They thought I was still the naive 25-year-old who had gotten pregnant out of wedlock, the family disappointment, who lived paycheck to paycheck. They had no idea that for the past several years I had climbed the ranks of Wall Street to become the managing director of Vanguard Vulture Capital, specializing in hostile takeovers and bad debt. The clinking of silverware slowed down as Patricia suddenly tapped her knife against her crystal wine glass. She reached under the table and pulled out a large, beautifully wrapped gift box, topped with a massive silver bow. She slid it across the smooth mahogany surface until it rested right in front of Mia. Mia gasped, her hands flying to her cheeks. She looked up at Patricia with wide, hopeful eyes. My mother offered a sickly sweet, tight-lipped smile that did not reach her cold eyes. "Go ahead and open it, sweetheart," Patricia said, her voice dripping with artificial affection. "I wanted to get you something that truly reflects what you and your mother bring to this family." Mia eagerly tore into the silver wrapping paper. She pulled off the bow, ripped through the tape, and lifted the heavy cardboard lid. She peered inside, her small hands digging into the white tissue paper. She pushed the paper aside, looking deeper, her brow furrowing in confusion. She reached the very bottom of the box. It was completely empty. Mia looked up, her lower lip trembling slightly. "Grandma?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackling fireplace in the corner of the room. "There is nothing inside." Patricia let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Exactly," she said, her voice dropping its sweet facade and turning instantly cruel. "You should not expect anything from a child like you. Takers do not get rewards in this world, Mia. You and your mother come to our home, eat our food, and offer nothing in return. It is time you learned how the real world works." Brittany took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive wine and leaned forward, a malicious smirk playing on her lips. Just like her mother, Brittany chimed in, her tone laced with pure venom. "Completely worthless. You are still living paycheck to paycheck, Cassidy. You are pushing papers for minimum wage while we host you in our mansion and let you pretend you belong here. It is honestly pathetic. We only invited you out of pity, but do not think for a second that makes us equals." Jamal chuckled deep in his chest, cutting a piece of meat and shaking his head. He did not even look at me, treating me as if I were invisible, a minor annoyance ruining his aesthetic holiday dinner. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the room. I felt the heat rising in my chest, the familiar urge to scream, to defend myself, to flip the table and shatter every crystal glass in the room. But I did not. I took a slow, steady breath. I was not the weak girl they used to bully. I was a predator in the financial world, and predators know exactly when to strike. I remained terrifyingly calm, my face a mask of absolute indifference, waiting for the perfect moment. I turned to look at my daughter, ready to comfort her, ready to wrap my arms around her and tell her we were leaving. But Mia surprised me. She did not burst into tears. She did not throw a tantrum or run away from the table. My brilliant, observant 9-year-old daughter simply reached up and wiped a single tear from her cheek. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and smiled politely at the woman who had just humiliated her for sport. "That is okay," Grandma Mia said softly, her voice remarkably steady. "I actually have a present for you, too." Patricia raised an eyebrow, looking genuinely caught off guard. Brittany frowned, exchanging a quick, confused glance with Jamal. Mia reached into the pocket of her little velvet dress and pulled out a small, heavy black velvet box. It looked exactly like the kind of box that holds expensive jewelry. She slid off her chair, walked around the large mahogany table, and handed the velvet box directly to Patricia. The entire table fell dead silent. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the massive room. Patricia looked at the velvet box in her hands, her eyes narrowing with suspicion, but the undeniable greed in her expression took over. She clearly expected a peace offering, perhaps a desperate attempt from me to buy her love with a piece of jewelry I could not afford. She gripped the edges of the box, her manicured nails digging into the velvet, and slowly popped the lid open. Patricia's expectant smile vanished the moment her manicured fingers reached into the black velvet. Her face twisted from greedy anticipation to absolute disgust. She pulled out a pair of hot pink plastic toy handcuffs and a thick laminated card printed with a harsh black and white QR code. The heavy crystal glasses on the table seemed to rattle as Patricia slammed both items down next to her turkey plate. "What is the meaning of this?" Patricia shrieked, her voice shattering the quiet elegance of the room. She glared at Mia, then turned her furious eyes on me. "I invite you into this home, I give you a seat at our table, and you allow your child to hand me cheap plastic garbage. You are raising a disrespectful, insolent little brat, Cassidy. This is exactly why you are a complete failure. You have zero class and zero control over your own offspring." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I calmly reached for my water goblet, the condensation cool against my fingertips. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone at the table shift uncomfortably in their seats. I set the glass down with a soft clink. "The handcuffs are plastic, Mother," I said, my voice carrying the absolute freezing authority of a boardroom executioner. "But the bank statements you will see when you scan that QR code are very, very real." Brittany scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her designer dress. "Bank statements? What are you talking about, Cassidy? Stop trying to create drama just because you are jealous of my house and my lifestyle." "Scan it," I commanded, locking eyes with my mother. Patricia's face paled slightly, a flicker of genuine panic breaking through her angry facade. She refused to touch the card, her hands trembling as she grabbed her wineglass instead. "Allow me," Jamal said, pulling out his latest smartphone with a heavy, condescending sigh. "Let us see what kind of pathetic fake documents the data entry clerk cooked up for us tonight." He aimed his camera at the laminated card. A second later, a secure PDF document populated on his screen. Jamal's arrogant smirk dropped instantly. He scrolled down his thumb, swiping faster and faster across the glass. "What is this?" he muttered, genuine confusion replacing his mockery. "These are Platinum American Express statements. The balances are in the tens of thousands. $43,212 to be exact," I stated clearly, reciting the figure from memory. "And those are just the balances from the last 3 years alone." I turned my gaze back to Patricia, who was now gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. "You thought I would never find out. You thought because I was just a struggling single mother, I would never have the resources to run a full federal background check on my own daughter. 5 years ago, when Mia was only 4 years old, you asked for her social security number. You claimed you wanted to open a small college savings bond for her. I trusted you. I leaned forward, the velvet fabric of my chair brushing against the hardwood. You did not open a savings bond, Mother. You and Gregory used my 4-year-old daughter's social security number to open 3 secret high-limit credit cards. You stole a child's identity to fund your desperate need to look rich. Brittany let out a sharp gasp, looking at our parents in absolute horror. Mom, is that true? Did you do that? It was a simple misunderstanding. Patricia stammered, her voice shrill and frantic. We were going to pay it back. We just needed a temporary bridge loan for some investments. You know how the market fluctuates. A bridge loan. I laughed, the sound harsh and entirely devoid of humor. You used my daughter's stolen identity to buy 2 luxury Mediterranean cruises. You bought first-class tickets to Greece. You bought the very diamond earrings you are wearing right now, Brittany. Yes, you heard me correctly. Your 30th birthday present was paid for by a 9-year-old's ruined credit score. Brittany instinctively reached up to touch the diamonds at her ears, looking as though the gems might suddenly burn her skin. She dropped her hands into her lap, staring at our mother as if looking at a stranger. Jamal was still staring at his phone, completely silent, analyzing the undeniable federal documents laid out before him. The irrefutable proof of financial crimes committed by his in-laws was right there in black and white. You destroyed Mia's credit before she even learned how to multiply. I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper that commanded the attention of the entire room. You committed federal identity theft and wire fraud. Those pink plastic handcuffs, consider them a visual aid. Because the real ones the authorities use are made of cold, heavy steel, and they are significantly less comfortable to wear. The entire dining room felt as though the oxygen had been violently sucked out. The facade of the wealthy, perfect American family was bleeding out over the Thanksgiving turkey. Patricia was trembling uncontrollably, her eyes darting frantically toward her husband for a rescue, desperate for someone to silence the truth I was finally speaking. Gregory's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He pushed his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the expensive Persian rug. He stood up to his full height, his chest heaving, slamming both of his heavy fists down onto the mahogany table with a force that made the fine china rattle and the wine spill. He glared at me, his eyes filled with absolute rage, preparing to launch the defense of his wife and annihilate me with the only weapon he thought he had left. You are an ungrateful, malicious wretch, Gregory roared, his voice booming through the dining room and bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. How dare you sit at this table, eat our food, and accuse your mother of a federal crime in front of this family? After everything we have done for you, after the sacrifices we made to keep you from ending up on the streets. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face, stepping away from his fallen chair. Have you forgotten where you came from, Cassidy? Have you forgotten who saved you? 9 years ago, you showed up at our doorstep at 25 years old, knocked up, abandoned, and completely ruined. You were a walking disaster. You brought nothing but shame to this family name. He slammed his hand on the table again, leaning forward so far I could see the spit flying from his lips. We took you in. We gave you a free roof over your head when no one else would look at you. We provided free housing, free utilities, and a safe place for you to birth that child. We clothed you when you had nothing. We fed you when you were starving. And this is how you repay us, by fabricating some ridiculous documents to attack the woman who gave you life. You are sick in the head. You are exactly the failure we always knew you would be. For a long moment, the only sound was Gregory's heavy breathing. Patricia was nodding along, tears of manufactured victimhood streaming down her face, playing the part of the wounded matriarch perfectly. She looked around the table, seeking validation, expecting everyone to immediately turn their disgust toward me. I looked at my father. I looked at the red veins popping in his forehead, the absolute conviction in his eyes that he held the moral high ground. And then I did the very last thing any of them expected. I laughed out loud. It was not a nervous giggle. It was a deep, resonant, completely genuine laugh that echoed through the silent mansion. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent 9 years sharpening her teeth in the most ruthless financial district in the world, listening to a desperate man try to rewrite history. Gregory froze, his mouth falling slightly open. Patricia stopped crying, her face twisting in confusion. Free housing, I asked, still chuckling as I shook my head. Free utilities, a safe place. That is a fascinating version of events, Gregory. Truly creative. It belongs in a fiction novel. I reached down to the floor beside my chair. I picked up my handbag. They always thought my bags were cheap knockoffs. They never recognized the understated elegance of custom Italian leather because it did not have a massive flashy designer logo plastered across the front. I unclasped the heavy brass hardware, reached inside, and pulled out a thick-bound stack of bank-verified cashed checks. I tossed them onto the table. They landed with a heavy thud next to the plastic handcuffs. Let us talk about this free roof, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Because I have a very different memory of that time. And unlike you, I brought the receipts. I leaned forward, tapping the stack of checks with my index finger. When I turned 18, my grandfather left me a $50,000 trust fund specifically earmarked for my college tuition and emergency living expenses. I never touched it. I wanted it to grow. But when I showed up pregnant at 25, needing a fraction of that money to get on my feet, the account was entirely empty. I locked eyes with my father. I watched the color rapidly drain from his face. Do you want to tell them where it went, Dad? I asked softly, the menace in my tone unmistakable. Or should I? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. You drained every single cent of my $50,000 trust fund to pay for Brittany's extravagant over-the-top wedding, I stated clearly, making sure Jamal heard every single word. You stole your youngest daughter's safety net to pay for imported ice sculptures, rare orchids flown in from Hawaii, and a 5-tier cake so you could show off to your country club friends. Brittany flinched, looking down at her plate, her perfect posture suddenly collapsing. And then I continued, my voice growing colder, harder. When I came to you desperate, pregnant, and broke entirely because of your theft, you did not give me a free roof. You forced me to live in your unfinished, mold-infested basement. A basement with no heating in the middle of a brutal New England winter. I slept on a damp mattress on a concrete floor. I wore coats to bed while carrying Mia. And the best part, the absolute pinnacle of your parental generosity, I picked up the stack of checks and fanned them out like a deck of playing cards. You charged me rent. You charged a pregnant woman whose money you had just stolen double the market rate for a toxic hazard of a basement. You told me it was a life lesson in responsibility. You forced me to scrub your hardwood floors and do your laundry just to cover the utilities you claimed were free. I stood up slowly, holding the thick stack of checks over the center of the table. Every single check I wrote you for 3 years. Every single cashed receipt from the bank with your signature on the back. I kept all of them. I opened my hand. The checks fluttered down, landing directly in the center of the elaborate table setting. A dozen of them splashed right into the crystal bowl of cranberry sauce, soaking up the dark red liquid staining the pristine white tablecloth. It ruined the perfect aesthetic of their perfect holiday dinner. I did not owe you a dime, I said, my voice echoing with finality. I paid for my own misery. I funded this family's delusions. You owed me. Gregory collapsed backward awkwardly, catching himself on the edge of the table since his chair was still knocked over. He looked small, suddenly deflated, his grand narrative of salvation completely destroyed by the physical evidence bleeding red sauce on the table. The power dynamic in the room had irreversibly shifted. I was no longer the tragic burden. But the golden child could never handle losing the spotlight, especially when her perfect wedding was brought into the line of fire. Brittany's face contorted with a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious indignation. She grabbed her heavy crystal wine glass, her knuckles turning white, and slammed it down onto the mahogany table so hard the stem violently snapped. Red wine splashed across her designer dress and pooled onto the polished wood. She leaped up from her chair, planting her hands firmly on the table, jumping straight into the fray to defend her parents and assert her dominance. Brittany slammed her hands on the mahogany table, ignoring the red wine dripping from her severed glass onto her white silk dress. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. You are completely delusional, Cassidy. How dare you speak to our parents that way? You are just a jealous, bitter little data entry clerk who cannot stand to see anyone else succeed. You ruined your life by getting pregnant at 25, and now you want to drag us all down into your miserable, pathetic reality. You think throwing fake checks into cranberry sauce makes you powerful? Brittany sneered, wiping red wine from her wrist. You are nothing. You live paycheck to paycheck in an apartment while I have built a perfect life. Look around you. Look at this mansion. My husband Jamal is a millionaire tech CEO. He is revolutionizing Silicon Valley while you push papers for minimum wage, and my wellness spa. It is the hottest franchise in the state. I am a self-made businesswoman. I have magazine covers, celebrity clients, and a lifestyle you could not ever dream of touching. You have absolutely nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic energy. Instead, I simply looked at my older sister with a profound sense of pity. I let her harsh words hang in the heavy air of the dining room for a long moment, allowing the deafening silence to suffocate her manufactured bravado. Your spa, I asked, my tone perfectly conversational. You mean the business that filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy exactly 2 years ago? Brittany physically recoiled as if I had struck her hard across the face. Her mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. The color completely drained from her face. Patricia and Gregory exchanged a panicked glance, clearly unaware of their golden child's hidden financial ruin. Oh, did you forget to mention that massive detail to Mom and Dad? I continued, leaning back comfortably. Did you forget to tell them your wellness empire was drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt? You expanded way too fast, Brittany. You leased commercial real estate you could not afford. You bought depreciating assets like marble reception desks, and you hemorrhaged cash on vanity marketing instead of actual customer retention. By November of 2 years ago, your vendors had frozen your accounts. Your payroll bounced twice. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on all 3 of your clinic locations. You were exactly 48 hours away from total liquidation and public disgrace. That is a complete lie! Brittany screamed, her voice cracking with sheer panic. She looked wildly around the room, desperate to maintain her illusion. We had a minor liquidity issue. That is all. It was normal growing pains for a massive franchise. An anonymous angel investor saw the immense value in my brand and bought out the bank debt. They injected fresh capital because my business model was absolutely flawless. I am still the founder. I am still the boss. I am still the face of the entire company. I smiled. It was the same cold, predatory smile I used during hostile boardroom takeovers in Manhattan. They did not buy your debt because your business model was flawless, Brittany, I stated clearly, letting every syllable land like a hammer strike. They bought your debt because the commercial bank was desperate to sell it for pennies on the dollar just to get your toxic liabilities off their quarterly balance sheets. And that anonymous angel investor did not inject capital out of the goodness of their heart. They forced a highly aggressive equity swap. I reached into my leather bag one more time and pulled out a single legal document printed on thick premium paper. It bore the heavy watermark of a top-tier corporate law firm. I tossed it lightly across the table. It slid over the polished mahogany and stopped right next to her broken wine glass. Read the signature on the bottom line, Brittany, I commanded. She stared at the document, her chest heaving rapidly. She slowly reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the contract. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text, reading the specific terms of the corporate buyout. When she finally reached the last page, her eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror. She dropped the heavy paper onto the table as if it had physically burned her skin. It was me, Brittany, I said softly, stripping away her dignity. I am the anonymous angel investor. My firm Vanguard Vulture Capital orchestrated the entire buyout through a blind shell corporation because I knew your massive ego would never allow you to accept a bailout from your failure of a sister. I paid off your toxic commercial loans to save this family from public embarrassment, but I certainly did not do it for free. I executed a total hostile equity takeover. I own 80% of your wellness franchise. I own your branding, commercial leases, equipment, and intellectual property. You do not own a company anymore, Brittany. You are nothing but a glorified salaried employee. You work for me. Looking at recent profit margins, I could legally terminate your employment contract tomorrow morning. Brittany sank back into her chair, breathless, the illusion of her perfect life completely shattered before her eyes. Her mouth opened and closed, but she could not formulate a single word of defense against the legal documents sitting on the table. A heavy dark shadow fell over me. Jamal stepped forward from the head of the table. He pushed his chair back with an aggressive scrape against the floorboards. His tailored suit shifted tightly across his broad shoulders as he took a threatening step toward my side of the table. He cracked his knuckles loudly, looming over my chair, trying to physically intimidate me into silence before I could destroy any more of his carefully constructed, fraudulent reality. Jamal straightened his bespoke suit jacket, exhaling a sharp, loud breath. He shot a look at Brittany, signaling her to step down, taking on the role of the rational, wealthy patriarch, managing an unruly guest. He rested his hands lightly on the back of Brittany's chair, looking at me with a mixture of feigned pity and intense annoyance. Cassidy, he said, his voice deep and smooth, adopting the practiced cadence of a CEO addressing a difficult employee. You are clearly having some kind of mental break. We all know you have struggled since you became a mother so young. The stress of your living situation must be catching up with you. But coming into my home and fabricating these insane lies about your sister and your parents is where I draw the line. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen twice. I suggest you take Mia and leave right now. Stop making up these unhinged stories before I have my private security team escort you off my property. I will not allow you to terrorize my family any further. I did not flinch. I did not look at his phone. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, interlacing my fingers. Your property? I asked, tilting my head slightly. That is a very interesting choice of words, Jamal. Tell me, how is your vintage Porsche collection doing? Jamal's confident, patronizing expression instantly shattered. His jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. His hand gripped the back of Brittany's chair with such force his knuckles turned white. What did you just say? He demanded, his voice dropping an octave, the smooth CEO facade completely vanishing. Brittany turned around, looking up at her husband in confusion. What is she talking about, Jamal? Your cars are in the climate-controlled garage downtown, right? I kept my eyes locked entirely on Jamal, watching the absolute panic flood into his chest. No, Brittany, they are not, I answered for him. Because last month your brilliant millionaire tech CEO husband quietly liquidated the entire collection. He sold the 1973 Carrera RS and the 1989 Speedster to a private buyer in Dubai for half their market value. Jamal opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off, raising my voice just enough to command the room. And that is not all he did, I continued, because even selling his prized cars was not enough to cover the massive hole he dug. 3 weeks ago, Jamal secretly took out a massive secondary mortgage on this beautiful, sprawling Connecticut mansion. He leveraged the equity of this entire estate right out from under you, Brittany. Brittany stood up slowly, her wine-stained dress clinging to her legs. She turned fully toward Jamal, her eyes wide, searching his face for a denial that was not there. Jamal, she whispered, her voice trembling. Is that true? Did you take out a second mortgage on our house? Why would you do that? The company is doing great. You just closed that Series B funding round. He did not close anything, Brittany, I said, driving the final nail into the coffin of their perfect marriage. Jamal has a severe gambling addiction. He owes over $4 million to an illegal sports betting syndicate operating out of a high-stakes poker room at the Bellagio in Las Vegas. He has been flying out there every other weekend for the past 2 years, telling you he was meeting with venture capitalists. He was not raising capital. He was bleeding it dry. He sold the cars and leveraged this house just to keep them from breaking his legs. Jamal, Brittany shrieked, grabbing his arm. Tell me she is lying. Tell me she fabricated this too. Jamal forcefully yanked his arm away from his wife. He did not look at her. He did not look at my parents, who were now staring at him in absolute horror. He only looked at me. His eyes were wild, completely unhinged. The sophisticated Silicon Valley titan was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal whose entire survival depended on silencing the threat in front of him. He let out a guttural roar, shoving Brittany's chair out of the way. He lunged toward my side of the table, his face twisted in pure, violent rage, completely losing his temper and preparing to cross a line he could never uncross. Jamal stopped mere inches from my face, his broad chest heaving under his ruined, wine-stained suit jacket. The veins in his neck were pulsing visibly. He pointed a thick manicured finger so close to my eye, I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "You think you are so smart?" he hissed, his voice dropping into a guttural, menacing growl. "You think because you dug up some garbage rumor about my finances you can walk into my home and disrespect me? I am a Silicon Valley titan. I am a visionary. You are a nobody. You are a glorified secretary who has accomplished absolutely nothing in her miserable 34 years of existence." Gregory's hand stopped inches from the SEC folder. The sudden flush of red consuming his face vanished, replaced by an ashen, sickly pallor. He slowly pulled his hand back, his fingers curling inward as if the very air around the table had turned to ice. Patricia let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her hand flying to her throat. The oppressive silence morphed into a thick, suffocating dread. I kept my gaze locked entirely on my father, refusing to let him look away. You see, Gregory, reading federal forensic accounting reports is a fascinating exercise in tracking human desperation. Jamal's pathetic little house of cards was actually collapsing over a year ago. The initial investors were getting angry. The fake dividend payments were drying up. His offshore accounts were bleeding cash to the Bellagio. The entire Ponzi scheme was on the absolute brink of a catastrophic, highly public implosion. But then a miracle happened. I began a slow, deliberate pace around the shattered crystal and spilled wine staining the expensive rug. Exactly 6 months ago, Jamal's fraudulent holding company received a massive, inexplicable influx of capital. A single wire transfer of $1.5 million hit his accounts and immediately breathed life back into his dying scam. It bought him another 6 months of pretending to be a Silicon Valley titan. It bought Brittany another 6 months of ignorant luxury. I stopped directly behind Gregory's chair, leaning down slightly, so my voice hovered right beside his ear. "Where did you get $1.5 million in liquid cash, Gregory?" I asked, letting the question hang in the dead air. Gregory stared straight ahead at the dining room wall, his jaw clenched so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding. Patricia began to shake her eyes, darting frantically between me, her husband, and Jamal. "Since you suddenly seem to have lost your commanding patriarchal voice, I will answer the question for you," I said, stepping away from his chair and reaching into the interior pocket of my trench coat. I retrieved a second, much thinner stack of papers. These were not stamped with federal seals. They bore the unmistakable embossed stamps of the county clerk real estate division. I tossed them onto the table right next to Jamal's SEC audit. I read the property deeds Gregory Verster stated, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I read the loan originations. I read the highly irregular, completely secretive reverse mortgage contracts you and Patricia signed exactly 6 months and 2 weeks ago. Patricia let out a whimpering moan, burying her face in her trembling hands. Gregory's shoulders collapsed inward, the illusion of his absolute authority evaporating instantly. "You owned that beautiful, sprawling retirement home free and clear." I continued, my words landing like physical blows. "It was your ultimate safety net. It was your entire life savings locked into a pristine piece of real estate. But you just could not resist the temptation of Jamal's fake pre-revenue valuation matrix, could you? You saw the imaginary 30% returns he was promising his wealthy country club marks, and your unmitigated greed completely overrode whatever basic financial literacy you possessed. You actively forged income verification documents. You bypassed the standard family trust protocols, and you heavily leveraged your fully paid-off retirement estate to hand $1.5 million in cash to a desperate, degenerate gambler." Brittany, who had been staring at Jamal with pure hatred, suddenly whipped her head around to stare at her parents. "You mortgaged the house," she whispered, her voice cracking with an entirely new wave of horror. "Mom, Dad, you gave him your house." "They did not just give him the house, Brittany," I corrected her, ensuring she understood the absolute totality of the destruction. They bet their entire lives on him. And let us track exactly where that retirement money went. Jamal did not invest a single dime in encrypted health data algorithms. He took your parents' $1.5 million and immediately wired $500,000 to his angriest early investors to keep them from calling the federal authorities. He used another $300,000 to pay off his most aggressive bookies in Las Vegas to prevent them from breaking his legs. And the rest. The rest went directly into maintaining the flawless facade you relentlessly demanded Brittany. It paid for your leased Tesla. It paid for the designer bags currently sitting in your closet. Your parents literally mortgaged their future to buy your jewelry. Jamal remained curled on the floor, his silence a complete and cowardly admission of guilt. Gregory stared at the county clerk documents on the table, his eyes wide and unblinking, looking at the papers as if they were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "Do you understand the sheer financial mechanics of what you have done?" Gregory the First asked, stepping back to take in the full pathetic picture of my family. "You took out a massive high-interest loan against your primary residence to invest in a company that does not actually exist. The company is a complete verifiable fraud. It produces absolutely no revenue. It has no tangible assets to liquidate. Every single penny of your $1.5 million is completely gone, vaporized into thin air." Patricia began to hyperventilate, pulling desperately at the collar of her expensive silk blouse as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. "You owe the bank $1.5 million, I stated, delivering the final mathematical reality with surgical precision. You have no income to cover the massive interest. Jamal is going to federal prison and cannot pay you back. I own his remaining debt. The bank will foreclose on your retirement home. They will evict you and auction it off. You have no savings. You have no investments. You have no home. You bet your entire life on his Ponzi scheme, and since the company is a fraud, your money is completely gone. You are destitute." He leaned in closer, his breath hot and ragged. "I will destroy you for this, Cassidy. I will hire the most ruthless corporate litigators on the East Coast. I will sue you for slander, defamation, and tortious interference. I will drag you through the court system and bury you in legal fees until you are completely bankrupt and homeless. I will make sure you lose custody of that kid, and I will make you crawl on your hands and knees begging me for a settlement you will never get." I did not blink. I did not step back. I looked past his towering, threatening frame to where my daughter was sitting, her eyes wide but surprisingly calm. The resilience I had taught her over the years was shining through. "Mia, sweetie," I said, my voice gentle and perfectly steady, completely ignoring the massive man threatening to destroy my life. "Why do you not take your tablet and go sit in the grand foyer for a few minutes? Mommy needs to have a grown-up conversation about business." Mia nodded silently. She grabbed her tablet, hopped off her chair, and quickly walked out of the dining room, her little velvet dress disappearing past the heavy oak double doors. I waited until I heard the distinct click of the doors shutting securely behind her. I wanted her safe from the absolute carnage that was about to unfold. Once Mia was gone, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I was no longer a mother trying to protect her child from a toxic family dinner. I was Vanguard Capital's most lethal weapon. I stood up slowly, matching Jamal's height as best I could in my heels. The calm, submissive daughter they had bullied for decades evaporated completely. I squared my shoulders, exuding an icy corporate dominance that made Jamal instinctively take a half-step backward. "You are not going to sue anyone, Jamal," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing off the mahogany walls. I reached down and grabbed the thick wool trench coat I had draped over the back of my chair. I slipped my hand into the deep inside pocket and pulled out a heavy, thick manila folder. Across the front, stamped in stark, glaring red ink, were the words, "Classified Federal Audit, do not duplicate." I held it up, letting the red letters burn into his retinas. "You are going to be far too busy dodging the Securities and Exchange Commission to worry about a petty defamation suit." Jamal's arrogant sneer faltered. He stared at the red stamp, his eyes darting frantically from the folder to my face and back again. The loud bravado he had just displayed vanished, replaced by the silent, suffocating panic of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a landmine that had already been triggered. I tossed the thick folder onto the table. It landed directly in the center of his empty, gold-rimmed dinner plate, with a heavy, sickening thud. "Open it," I commanded. "Let us talk about your visionary tech company." Jamal's hands hovered over the heavy manila folder, as if it were laced with anthrax. The stark red lettering of the federal stamp seemed to burn through his arrogant facade. Slowly, with fingers that had suddenly developed a violent tremor, he flipped the cover open. The first page bore the unmistakable imposing seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, followed by 100 pages of densely packed financial forensic analysis. It was a complete, unredacted autopsy of his entire corporate existence. "What is this?" Jamal whispered, his voice cracking entirely devoid of the booming authoritative tone he had used to threaten me just moments ago. He frantically flipped through the pages, his eyes darting across highlighted bank routing numbers, offshore shell company ledgers, and highlighted federal statutes detailing severe financial crimes. "That is the absolute end of your Silicon Valley Titan fantasy, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice cold and measured, ensuring every single syllable echoed through the dead silent dining room. I read the entire file on my flight up here. Your visionary tech startup is nothing but a masterclass in criminal deception. You do not have a revolutionary software platform. You do not have an encrypted health data algorithm. In fact, according to the Federal Cybercrimes Division, you do not even employ a single software engineer. Brittany let out a choked gasp, clutching her chest, her wine-stained silk dress trembling. "What is she talking about, Jamal?" She pleaded, her voice thick with tears and rising panic. "You just hired 20 new developers last month. You showed me the payroll documents. You told me the beta testing phase was completely successful. He showed you a fabricated Excel spreadsheet, Brittany." I corrected her, never breaking eye contact with Jamal. "He does not have a tech company. He has a textbook Ponzi scheme. There is absolutely zero actual revenue. There never was. Jamal has spent the last 3 years running a sophisticated affinity fraud operation. He targets wealthy, naive investors from your exclusive country club, promises them a 30% guaranteed return on an imaginary medical software product, and then uses the capital from new investors to pay the initial dividends to the old ones." "That is a lie," Jamal shouted, slamming his hand against the table, but the conviction was completely gone. The sweat was now beading heavily on his forehead, rolling down his temples, and soaking into his expensive collar. "You do not understand high-level venture capital, Cassidy. You are too ignorant to grasp the complexities of early-stage hypergrowth. This is not a fraudulent scheme. It is a highly strategic temporary liquidity restructuring. We are simply leveraging bridge capital to optimize our pre-revenue valuation matrix before our initial public offering. You have no idea what you are looking at." I let out a harsh, genuinely amused laugh. "A liquidity restructuring?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is that the buzzword you use to comfort yourself when you are transferring stolen funds into your personal offshore accounts? Do not try to insult my intelligence with entry-level tech jargon, Jamal. You are not speaking to a gullible housewife at a charity gala. You are speaking to someone who dissects fraudulent corporate structures and toxic asset ledgers for a living." I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the mahogany table, invading his space entirely. "Let us break down exactly what your liquidity restructuring actually looks like under federal statutes. You committed Title 18 United States Code Section 1343 wire fraud. The moment you emailed those fabricated quarterly earnings reports across state lines to the institutional investors in New York. You engaged in willful corporate embezzlement when you funneled $2 million of Series A funding through a dummy corporation in the Cayman Islands to pay off your illegal sports betting syndicate at the Bellagio." Jamal shrank back, his broad shoulders collapsing inward as I systematically dismantled his entire life with surgical precision. "The SEC forensic accountants tracked every single transaction." I continued, my voice relentless, drowning out his heavy, panicked breathing. "They matched the timestamp of your offshore wire transfers directly to the casino cashier deposits in Las Vegas. They know about the shell companies registered in Delaware. They know about the forged signatures on the Series B term sheets. They know that you used the remaining investor capital to buy Brittany's diamond necklaces, your leased Tesla, and the massive down payment on this ridiculous mansion. You did not build a business empire, Jamal. You built a spectacular house of cards out of stolen money, and the wind has finally started to blow. Patricia and Gregory sat completely frozen, their faces drained of all color, looking like statues carved from fear. The realization that their golden son-in-law was a massive federal criminal was visibly destroying them. They had worshipped his fake success and constantly bragged about his massive wealth. Now the heavy reality that they were deeply entangled in his financial web began to dawn on them, leaving them speechless and utterly paralyzed. Jamal shook his head wildly, a look of pure, unadulterated desperation washing over his features. The Silicon Valley Titan was dead. The man left standing was nothing but a terrified, cornered fraudster staring down a decade in federal prison. He looked at the classified folder, then up at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The math in his head was finally catching up to the reality of the situation. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. How he choked out his voice, barely a whisper, completely stripped of any remaining pride. How could you possibly have this? You are a nobody. You type numbers into a computer for $30,000 a year. This is a highly restricted classified federal investigation. These documents are completely sealed. How does a low-level data entry clerk get her hands on an active SEC audit? Because I do not input data, Jamal, I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the dining room like a freshly sharpened blade. I never have. You and Brittany simply assume that because I lived a modest life and prioritized raising my daughter over buying depreciating designer handbags, I must be scraping the bottom of the corporate barrel. I let you believe it because it kept you careless. It kept you completely blind. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest, watching the color completely drain from his sweating face. I am the managing director of Vanguard Vulture Capital. I do not just push papers. I buy highly distressed assets, I dismantle poorly managed corporate structures, and I systematically liquidate fraudulent companies exactly like yours. Jamal physically staggered backward as if I had shoved him. He bumped into the edge of the mahogany sideboard, his hands grasping blindly behind him for support. His mouth opened and closed, searching for words that simply refused to materialize. The SEC audit sitting on his dinner plate was no longer just a threat. It was a death sentence delivered by the exact person he had spent years treating like an uneducated peasant. You see, Jamal? I continued, rising slowly from my seat to ensure I had the absolute physical and psychological high ground in the room when a tech startup suddenly hemorrhages capital without producing a single line of viable code the market notices. When a CEO starts aggressively leveraging personal real estate and liquidating private car collections to cover unexplained cash flow gaps, red flags trigger across every major financial monitoring system in the city. The SEC started investigating your fictitious software company 6 months ago. But federal agencies move slowly. They build cases over years. I do not have that kind of patience. Vanguard Vulture Capital operates on a much faster timeline. I walked around the edge of the table, my heels clicking sharply against the imported hardwood floor. Every eye in the room followed me. My parents were completely paralyzed, trapped in a waking nightmare as their golden child's perfect life disintegrated before their eyes. When the illegal sports betting syndicate realized you could not cover the massive hole you dug at the Bellagio, they did what any smart, ruthless organization does, I explained, stopping just a few feet away from where Jamal was cowering against the furniture. They offloaded the liability. They bundled your toxic, uncollectible gambling debt and quietly offered it to private equity firms specializing in high-risk debt recovery. It is a very niche market. Only a handful of firms have the capital and the stomach to buy that kind of underground paper. Jamal was shaking now. A fine tremor had taken over his hands and his breathing was shallow and erratic. He knew exactly what I was about to say. I could see the realization breaking him from the inside out. Last week, my highly specialized financial firm officially stepped right in, I said, delivering the fatal and final blow with utter terrifying calmness. Vanguard Vulture Capital bought out the entirety of your massive $12 million debt. We purchased it for pennies on the dollar because your creditors knew you were completely broke and headed for federal prison. But to me, that debt was incredibly valuable. It was the key to tearing down the fraudulent empire you built on the backs of innocent people. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he and Brittany could hear the absolute finality of my words. I did not just expose you to the federal government tonight, Jamal. I bought you. I bought your debt. I am your sole creditor. I hold the paper on every single cent you owe. That means I own your fake tech company. I own the remaining assets in your offshore accounts. I own whatever is left of your liquidated car collection. And because you so foolishly leveraged this estate to try and save yourself, I own the very roof over your head. You have absolutely nothing. Every cent you thought you had belongs to me. You are financially ruined, legally cornered, and entirely at my mercy. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the sound of a total, irreversible collapse. Jamal slid down the front of the sideboard, his knees finally giving out. He hit the floor hard, pulling his knees to his chest, burying his face in his hands. The polished, arrogant tech titan had been reduced to a weeping, broken shell of a man in less than 10 minutes. But the real explosion did not come from Jamal. It came from the opposite side of the table. Brittany had been standing completely frozen since I dropped the SEC folder on the table. She had listened to every word, her mind desperately trying to process the magnitude of the deception. The realization that her perfect magazine cover life was entirely funded by stolen money and illegal gambling debts finally crashed over her. She looked at the expensive rings on her fingers, the lavish dining room around her, and then down at her pathetic husband crying on the floor. She was now completely broke. Her spa was gone, her mansion was gone, her wealthy status was an illusion, and the man who had promised her the world had secretly gambled it all away, leaving her publicly humiliated and destitute. A terrifying guttural sound ripped from Brittany's throat. It was not a sob. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated fury. She snatched the heavy crystal wine decanter right off the exact center of the dining table. She did not look at me. Her intense, burning wrath had completely shifted, suddenly laser-focused entirely on the treacherous man who had just permanently ruined her entire life. She turned her blazing, murderous eyes away from me and locked them onto her husband, raising the heavy crystal decanter high above her head as she marched aggressively toward him. The crystal decanter swung through the air in a violent arc. Jamal raised his arms just in time, catching the brutal blow on his thick forearm. The impact was sickeningly loud. The antique crystal shattered, exploding into jagged shards across the Persian rug. Red wine splashed across his face like a spray of blood. Brittany did not stop. She lunged at him, her manicured nails curling into claws as she struck his chest. "You ruined me!" Brittany shrieked, her voice tearing through the room with a shrill, animalistic desperation. She pounded her fists against his sternum, her white silk dress now soaked in crimson stains. "You disgusting, pathetic fraud! How am I supposed to show my face at the country club tomorrow? How am I supposed to walk into the charity gala next week? You told me we had generational wealth. The other wealthy wives are going to laugh at me. I am the face of success, and you turned me into a bankrupt joke." Jamal endured the assault for only a few seconds before his own resentment boiled over. He grabbed Brittany by both wrists and shoved her backward with terrifying force. Brittany stumbled, catching on the edge of the rug, and crashed hard into the velvet wainscoting of the dining room wall. She gasped for air, but Jamal did not give her a second to recover. He advanced on her, pointing a shaking finger directly at her chest. "Do not you dare act like the victim here!" Jamal roared, the veins in his neck bulging as he unleashed years of toxic pressure. "You think I wanted to owe millions to violent criminals? I did it to fund your insatiable, greedy lifestyle. You and your parents demanded absolute perfection from the exact day we got married. Do you have any idea how much capital it takes to maintain this charade? The private jets to Aspen? The $50,000 Birkin bags? The $250,000 we blew on your pathetic wellness spa?" He paced back and forth, waving his hands frantically. Your entire existence is a giant financial black hole. I pulled money from new investors just to pay for your massive wardrobe and your parents' extravagant anniversary trips, because the golden child must look like royalty. I committed federal wire fraud to keep a roof over your head, because your ego could never handle the reality of being average. You bled me dry, Brittany. I stood quietly near the head of the mahogany table, my hands resting smoothly inside my trench coat pockets. I did not say a single word. The flow of conflict had entirely shifted. It was no longer me fighting against a unified hostile family front. The Vanguard Vulture Capital buyout had successfully detonated the core of their fraudulent existence, and now I simply got to watch the blast wave tear them apart. This was the spectacular, agonizing collapse of the golden child. I watched as the toxic family unit, which had spent 3 decades demanding my absolute submission, finally turned its ravenous teeth upon itself. Brittany was weeping ugly mascara, stained tears mourning her lost social status rather than her husband's impending prison sentence. Jamal was pacing like a caged beast, loudly listing every financial sacrifice he had made. The loyalty they had always claimed bound this family together was completely exposed as a transactional sham. The moment the money evaporated, the moment the illusion of superiority vanished, their familial love dissolved into vicious, cutthroat survivalism. They were tearing each other to shreds over country club memberships, while federal agents were likely already drafting the criminal indictments. It was a beautiful, validating spectacle. I had spent my entire life believing I was the broken piece of this family. But standing here watching the billionaires claw at each other's throats, I realized the table itself was entirely rotten. The chaotic, screaming match between husband and wife was suddenly interrupted by a loud, authoritative slam. Gregory, my father, had grabbed a heavy silver serving spoon and struck it violently against the polished wood of the dining table. The sharp noise cut through Brittany's sobbing and Jamal's pacing. Patricia and Gregory stood up simultaneously. Their faces were pale and drawn, the shock of the SEC revelation finally wearing off, replaced by a desperate need to assert control over a situation rapidly spiraling out of their grasp. Patricia rushed over to Brittany, wrapping her arms around her weeping, ruined golden daughter, glaring at Jamal with absolute venom. Gregory stepped between them, pushing Jamal back. "That is enough!" Gregory barked, his voice trembling, but attempting to project his usual patriarchal dominance. "We are not going to behave like wild animals in this house. We are going to handle this like a family." He turned away from the shattered couple and looked directly across the room at me. I expected intense anger. I expected him to curse my name, to banish me for destroying the pristine image he had curated. But the look in his eyes was not fury. It was pure, cold calculation. Gregory straightened his posture, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked at the classified federal audit sitting on Jamal's plate, then looked back at my calm, unbothered face. He did not offer a single apology for the decades of abuse. Instead, his mind had simply pivoted to how my newfound wealth and absolute power could serve his immediate needs. "Cassidy," my father said, his voice adopting that familiar demanding tone he used whenever he expected me to blindly fall in line. "You are the managing director of this equity firm. You own the corporate debt. That means you control the financial assets, and you control the narrative. This federal investigation is going to humiliate us. It will ruin my standing at the corporate firm, and it will permanently destroy your sister's life. I expect you to make some calls right now. You are going to use your firm's resources to bury this audit, bail Jamal out, and fix this disaster immediately." The heavy crystal decanter came crashing down with sickening force. Jamal raised his arms to shield his head, catching the brutal impact against his thick forearm. The antique crystal shattered instantly, exploding into jagged shards that rained down across the expensive Persian rug. A red stain of leftover wine splashed across his face like a spray of blood, but Brittany did not stop there. She lunged at him, her manicured fingers curling into vicious claws as she struck his chest. "You ruined me!" Brittany shrieked, her voice tearing through the dining room with a shrill, animalistic desperation. She pounded her fists against his sternum, completely unhinged. "You disgusting, pathetic fraud! How am I supposed to show my face at the country club tomorrow? How am I supposed to walk into the charity gala next week? You told me we had generational wealth. The other wealthy wives are going to laugh at me. I am the face of success, and you turned me into a bankrupt joke. Jamal endured the frantic assault for only a few seconds before his own resentment boiled over. He grabbed Brittany by both wrists, twisting them painfully, and shoved her backward with terrifying, reckless force. Brittany stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the rug, and crashed hard against the velvet wainscoting of the dining room wall. She gasped for air, momentarily stunned, but Jamal did not give her a single second to recover. He advanced on her, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at her face. "Do not you dare act like the victim here!" Jamal roared, the veins in his neck bulging as he unleashed years of toxic, suppressed pressure. "You think I wanted to owe millions to violent criminals? I did it to fund your insatiable, greedy lifestyle? You and your parents demanded absolute perfection from the exact day we got married. Do you have any idea how much capital it takes to maintain this charade? The private jets to Aspen, the $50,000 Birkin bags, the $250,000 we blew on your pathetic wellness spa." He paced back and forth, waving his hands frantically, completely abandoning the polished CEO persona. "Your entire existence is a giant financial black hole. I pulled money from new investors just to pay for your massive wardrobe and your parents' extravagant anniversary trips, because the golden child must always look like royalty. I committed federal wire fraud to keep a roof over your head, because your fragile ego could never handle the reality of being average." You bled me dry, Brittany. I stood quietly near the head of the mahogany table, my hands resting smoothly inside my trench coat pockets. I did not say a single word. The flow of conflict had entirely shifted. It was no longer me fighting against a unified, hostile family front. The Vanguard Vulture Capital buyout had successfully detonated the core of their fraudulent existence, and now I simply got to watch the blast wave tear them apart. This was the spectacular, agonizing collapse of the golden child. I watched as the toxic family unit, which had spent 3 decades demanding my absolute submission, finally turned its ravenous teeth upon itself. Brittany was weeping ugly mascara-stained tears, mourning her lost social status, rather than her husband's impending prison sentence. Jamal was pacing like a caged beast, loudly listing every financial sacrifice he had made. The loyalty they had always claimed bound this family together was completely exposed as a transactional sham. The moment the money evaporated, the moment the illusion of superiority vanished, their familial love dissolved into vicious, cutthroat survivalism. They were tearing each other to shreds over country club memberships, while federal agents were likely already drafting the criminal indictments. It was a beautiful, validating spectacle. I had spent my entire life believing I was the broken piece of this family. But standing here watching the billionaires claw at each other's throats, I realized the table itself was entirely rotten. The chaotic screaming match between husband and wife was suddenly interrupted by Patricia. Patricia wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her demeanor shifting with terrifying speed. The grieving, shocked mother vanished instantly, replaced by the toxic, demanding matriarch I had known my entire life. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing as she assessed my tailored coat and the undeniable confidence radiating from my posture. She completely ignored the destruction Jamal had just laid bare. "Cassidy." Patricia demanded, her voice dripping with that familiar, sickeningly sweet entitlement. "You are the managing director of this firm. You own the corporate debt. That means you control the assets. You have to forgive his debt right now. You are rich now. You clearly have more money than you could ever need. You cannot just stand there and let your own sister go bankrupt. It will completely ruin our family name. The social fallout will be catastrophic." I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the depths of her delusion. "I do not do charity for fraudsters, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And I certainly do not protect the family name that was used to destroy my daughter's credit." Gregory's face darkened with sudden explosive rage. The mask of the calm patriarch completely fell away. He lunged forward, his hand slamming down on the table as he reached aggressively for the classified SEC documents I had placed near the centerpiece. "You will do as you are told," he bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "I am the patriarch of this family, and I demand you sign those debt documents over to me right this instant." I easily stepped out of his reach, picking up the folder before his grasping fingers could make contact. I looked at my parents with absolute, unadulterated pity. "You really want to play the patriarch, Gregory?" I asked softly. "Let us talk about how you funded Jamal in the first place." The absolute finality of my words hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the entire room exploded. The shock paralyzing Gregory finally shattered, replaced instantly by a primal, unhinged rage. A raw, guttural roar tore from his throat. He lunged across the space between them, his hands outstretched like claws, and grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his tailored Tom Ford suit. The sheer momentum of the older man's assault threw Jamal backward. They crashed violently into the edge of the dining table. The heavy mahogany groaned under their combined weight. A towering crystal vase filled with an elaborate floral arrangement toppled over, sending water and crushed white roses spilling across the imported rug. Gregory slammed Jamal against the wood, his knuckles turning white as he twisted the expensive fabric of Jamal's jacket. "You stole my life," Gregory screamed, spit flying from his mouth, his face a mask of purple fury. "I worked 40 years to build my retirement. 40 years I gave you my home. I gave you everything." Jamal choked his hands, coming up to pry Gregory's fingers from his throat. "Get off me, old man," Jamal wheezed, his eyes bulging as he struggled against the sheer adrenaline fueling my father's assault. They grappled along the edge of the table, their violent struggle catching the edge of the massive linen runner. With a sickening crash, the entire Thanksgiving feast was dragged onto the floor. Expensive china shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Crystal wine glasses exploded, sending shards of glass and deep red Cabernet spraying across the velvet chairs and the ivory walls. The roasted turkey, the silver platters of meticulously prepared side dishes, and the lit centerpieces tumbled into a chaotic, ruinous pile. The pristine magazine cover aesthetic of Brittany's dining room was instantly transformed into a literal battlefield of shattered glass and ruined food. Patricia did not even attempt to stop the physical brawl between her husband and her son-in-law. Her eyes wide with sheer terror and malice snapped toward her daughter. The maternal comfort she had offered Brittany just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a vicious, venomous glare. "This is your fault," Patricia shrieked, marching toward Brittany and jabbing a manicured finger at her face. "You brought this criminal into our family. You paraded him around like a trophy. You told us he was a visionary. You convinced your father to leverage our home because you just had to have a husband who could fund your pathetic vanity projects. You ruined us, Brittany. You absolutely ruined us." Brittany recoiled, her back hitting the wall, her face smeared with mascara and tears. For a second, the lifelong conditioning of the golden child took over, and she looked like a terrified little girl. But the impending reality of bankruptcy and public humiliation ignited a vicious spark of self-preservation. "Do not you dare put this on me!" Brittany screamed back, her voice echoing over the sound of breaking glass as Gregory shoved Jamal into a display cabinet. "You pushed me into this. You have been shoving me toward wealthy men since I was 16 years old. You literally told me to ignore the red flags. When I told you his accounting did not make sense last year, what did you say, Mother? You told me not to ask questions that might kill the golden goose." Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her chest in feigned outrage. "I did no such thing." "You are a liar!" Brittany shrieked, stepping forward, towering over our shrinking mother. "You wanted the country club status. You wanted to brag to your friends about your billionaire son-in-law. You orchestrated this entire marriage to secure your own social climbing agenda. You sold me to a fraudster so you could play the wealthy matriarch, and now you want to blame me because your own greed blew up in your face." I stepped back, moving smoothly out of the splash zone of spilled wine and broken china. I crossed my arms and simply watched the spectacle unfold. For 30 years, I had been the designated punching bag of this family. I had endured the constant comparisons, the relentless financial belittlement, and the orchestrated campaigns to make me feel small. I had spent countless nights wondering what I was doing wrong, why my hard work was invisible to them, and why their love was so strictly conditional upon maintaining a fake hollow image. I did not have to wonder anymore. I did not even have to raise my voice. I stood untouched amidst the utter chaos, watching the golden facade melt away to reveal the absolute rot beneath. The toxic family unit was devouring itself. The mother was cannibalizing the daughter to save her own ego. The father was physically trying to strangle the golden son-in-law to reclaim his stolen pride. The husband and wife were tearing each other to shreds over money that never even existed. It was the sweetest, most profound silence I had ever experienced. The years of being the scapegoat were fully and completely avenged by simply holding up a mirror and letting them destroy themselves with their own reflections. A sharp tearing sound ripped through the room. Jamal finally broke free from Gregory's grip. The violent movement tore the shoulder seam of Jamal's custom suit entirely open, leaving the expensive fabric hanging in tatters. He shoved the older man backward, sending Gregory stumbling into a heavy wooden chair. Jamal stood panting heavily in the center of the ruined dining room, his chest heaving, his face covered in sweat and spilled wine. He looked around at the destroyed room at his weeping wife, and then his eyes locked onto me. He straightened his spine, pulling the ruined edges of his jacket together. The cornered, terrified fraudster vanished, replaced by a desperate, arrogant survivor. "You think you hold all the cards," Cassidy Jamal sneered, a manic, dangerous light flickering in his eyes. "You think buying my debt gives you absolute control, but you missed a critical clause in Vanguard's acquisition contract. There is a legal loophole regarding the offshore asset transfers, and I am going to use it to bury you." I stared at him, my expression completely flat, waiting for whatever pathetic defense mechanism he was about to cling to. Jamal wiped a smear of blood from his split lip using the back of his hand and let out a sharp, maniacal laugh. The sound echoed through the ruined dining room, grating and desperate. He pushed himself off the heavy wooden chair, his chest still heaving, and took a step toward me. The torn fabric of his custom suit flapped uselessly against his arm. "You really think you have won, Cassidy?" Jamal sneered, a manic, dangerous light flickering in his eyes. "You think you can just waltz in here with a few pieces of paper and throw us out onto the street today? This is America. You cannot just snap your fingers and kick us out. The legal system protects tenants, even the ones facing foreclosure. It takes months, sometimes even years, to legally evict someone." He threw his arms out wide, gesturing to the sprawling, high-ceilinged room and the shattered remnants of their Thanksgiving feast. "I know the law. I know my squatter's rights. We will live in this mansion, sleeping in our California king bed and drinking whatever expensive wine is left in the cellar, until the bank physically drags us out. I will tie this foreclosure up in so much litigation you will be begging to settle, just to cover the firm's legal fees. I will file injunction after injunction. I will claim extreme financial hardship. I will bankrupt this entire process before I ever let you see me pack a single box." The sheer audacity of his claim hung in the air. He was a confessed fraudster, standing ankle-deep in spilled wine and broken china, actively boasting about abusing the legal system to prolong his luxurious lifestyle. It was the absolute pinnacle of toxic entitlement. Brittany, who had been shrinking against the wainscoting just moments before, suddenly perked up. The reality of Jamal's words washed over her, reigniting that deeply ingrained superiority complex she had wielded against me since childhood. She wiped her tears away with the heels of her hands, smearing her expensive mascara across her cheekbones in dark, jagged streaks. She stepped away from the wall, her posture straightening as she looked at me. A cruel, triumphant smirk broke through her ruined makeup. "He is right," Brittany said, her voice regaining its familiar, condescending edge. "You cannot just throw us out. This is our home. My name is on the marital asset documents. We have tenant rights. We have residency established. We are not leaving. You can wave those federal documents around all you want, Cassidy, but you cannot touch us today. We are going to stay right here, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it." Patricia and Gregory exchanged a rapid, desperate glance. The prospect of squatting in a foreclosed mansion was humiliating, but it was better than being homeless. Their survival instinct latched onto Jamal's manic loophole. Patricia lifted her chin, attempting to salvage whatever shred of matriarchal dignity she could muster. "We will hire the best defense attorneys in the state," Patricia declared, her voice trembling, but defiant. "We will counter-sue your firm for aggressive debt collection practices. We will tie this up in court for a decade if we have to. You may have the paperwork, Cassidy, but we have the house. We are not going anywhere." I listened to their unified chorus of delusion, completely unfazed. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply let them bask in their imaginary victory for a few precious seconds. I let them believe that they had found the ultimate escape hatch, that their manipulative tactics would save them one last time. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, I raised my left arm and checked the face of my luxury watch. The steady ticking of the second hand felt incredibly loud in the suddenly quiet room. I lowered my wrist and looked up, meeting Jamal's bloodshot eyes. "You are absolutely right, Jamal," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "The eviction process in this state is notoriously slow. It requires formal notices, court dates, appeals, and endless bureaucratic red tape. It can take 6 to 8 months, sometimes longer, just to get a sheriff to execute a basic writ of possession." Jamal smirked, crossing his arms over his chest, clearly believing he had checkmated me. "See?" he mocked. "You lose." I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold, calculated smile of someone who had anticipated their every move months in advance. "Eviction takes months," I repeated, nodding in agreement. "Which is exactly why I never filed for eviction." The smug satisfaction vanished from Jamal's face, replaced by a sudden, creeping confusion. Brittany's smirk faltered. Gregory narrowed his eyes, sensing the trap closing around them. "What are you talking about?" Jamal demanded, his voice losing its confident edge. "If you did not file for eviction, you cannot force us out." "I did not file for eviction, Jamal, because you are not a tenant facing a simple civil foreclosure," I explained, stepping closer to the shattered dining table. "You committed federal wire fraud. You ran a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme across state lines. You defrauded accredited investors and falsified SEC documents. Those are not civil matters. Those are federal crimes. And when the federal government uncovers a criminal enterprise of this magnitude, they do not bother with eviction notices. They execute asset forfeiture." I stated, the words dropping like an anvil in the center of the room. "They freeze your bank accounts, they seize your vehicles, and they raid your properties to preserve evidence. You do not get squatters' rights when the property is an active federal crime scene." I lifted my hand and pointed a steady finger toward the front of the house. "Look out the window, Jamal." Red and blue police lights were suddenly flashing through the glass. Jamal smirked, crossing his arms over his torn jacket as he fully leaned into his delusion. He genuinely believed his little squatter loophole was the ultimate shield against the consequences of his actions. Brittany mirrored his arrogant posture, her chin raised in a pathetic display of defiance. They both thought they had checkmated me. "You fundamentally misunderstood the reality of my job, Jamal," I said, my voice effortlessly cutting through the lingering tension in the room. "I am not a debt collector. I am a corporate liquidator specializing in fraudulent assets. I did not take your forged documents and fake revenue projections to a civil court attorney. Civil court is for disputes over contracts and missed payments. What you did was steal millions of dollars across state lines. I handed your entire forensic audit directly to the federal government. I watched as they traced every single illegal transaction back to this very dining room." Jamal stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of a shattered dining chair. He looked like he was going to vomit. "You gave them everything," he choked out, his voice a pathetic squeak. "Every single fabricated spreadsheet, every offshore wire transfer receipt, and every email where you instructed your accountant to lie," I confirmed. The federal authorities were absolutely thrilled to receive it. They moved with unprecedented speed. A federal judge reviewed the dossier and signed an emergency asset seizure order early this morning. Brittany practically lunged at me, her face contorted in a mix of fury and panic. "You cannot let them take our house," she screamed, her voice cracking. "We have rights. We own this property." "You own absolutely nothing, Brittany," I corrected her sharply. "You need to listen to me very carefully because your reality has just permanently altered. This mansion, the cars in the garage, the jewelry you are wearing, and the accounts holding your parents' retirement funds are no longer classified as personal property. Because Jamal used the initial investments from his fraudulent tech company to pay the mortgage and fund your lifestyle, every single asset you possess was bought with illicit funds generated by federal wire fraud." I took a step toward them, forcing them to hear every word. Under federal forfeiture laws, property purchased or maintained with the proceeds of a crime is subject to immediate seizure. This house does not belong to you. It does not even belong to the bank anymore. As of this morning, it belongs completely and irrevocably to the federal government. And because Vanguard Capital formally acquired the corporate debt before the Fed stepped in, my firm holds the primary lien on whatever assets the government eventually liquidates. I made sure we get paid first. You get absolutely nothing. Gregory sank heavily into his chair, the remaining color completely draining from his face. "They are going to take everything," he whispered, staring blankly at the ruined Thanksgiving turkey on the floor. "My pension. My savings. The house." "Yes, Gregory," I said, feeling a profound sense of closure. "You gambled your entire existence on a criminal, and the house always wins. In this case, Vanguard Capital is the house." The sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway shattered the momentary silence. Patricia let out a terrified shriek and scrambled toward the large bay windows facing the front lawn. Brittany followed her, pressing her hands against the glass. "Oh my God!" Brittany sobbed, her voice trembling with raw hysteria. "Oh my God, Jamal! Look at what you did!" I walked calmly to the window and stood behind them, observing the spectacular culmination of their greed. Dozens of police cruisers poured through the ornate iron gates, their silenced sirens and flashing light bars illuminating the expansive manicured lawn in a blinding display of absolute authority. Behind the cruisers came a fleet of unmarked black SUVs. The vehicles swarmed the circular driveway, moving with precise tactical coordination to block every possible exit. Heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical vests began pouring out of the SUVs. They moved swiftly across the lawn to secure the estate. Local police officers established a barricade at the front gate, turning away curious neighbors stepping out to watch the spectacle. "This is not happening," Patricia muttered, her hands pulling at her hair as she backed away from the window. "This cannot be happening to us. We are good people. We belong at the country club. What will the neighbors say?" Even now, staring down the barrel of total ruination and federal indictments, her primary concern was her social standing. It was a pathetic, fitting end to a lifetime built entirely on superficial vanity. Jamal was frantically pacing the room, pulling at his torn suit jacket, desperately looking for an exit that did not exist. "I need to call my lawyer," he babbled, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I need a defense attorney. I have rights." "Your phone is already tapped, Jamal," I stated calmly, "and your accounts are frozen. You cannot afford a defense attorney. You are going to be relying on a public defender." Brittany collapsed onto the floor, ignoring the shards of broken glass, and began to wail. It was a loud, piercing sound of pure defeat. The golden child, the perfect daughter who had demanded luxury and perfection her entire life, was reduced to a sobbing mess on a ruined rug, waiting to be escorted out of her stolen mansion by federal agents. The heavy synchronized sound of combat boots marching up the front porch steps echoed through the massive foyer. The imposing oak double doors rattled violently on their hinges. The pounding was deafening, a forceful hammering that shook the walls and vibrated through the floorboards. Jamal froze, his phone slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the hardwood floor. Patricia cried out and clamped her hands over her ears. "Federal Bureau of Investigation!" A booming voice echoed through the thick wood of the front doors. Open the doors right now before we smash them down. The booming, authoritative voice outside sucked the remaining oxygen directly out of the dining room. For a second, the family remained frozen in absolute horror. Flashing red and blue lights pulsed through the bay windows, painting their pale faces in alternating strokes of neon color. Then the paralysis broke, and pure panic took over. The 60 seconds before the breach felt like a psychological pressure cooker detonating in front of me. Jamal spun around his dress shoes, slipping frantically on the wine-soaked Persian rug. His arrogant facade and smug certainty vanished into thin air. He looked exactly like a cornered rat. Abandoning Brittany without a single glance backward, he shoved past her so violently she crashed into the wainscoting. He sprinted toward the kitchen, swinging doors, his torn jacket flapping wildly behind him as he desperately sought a backdoor exit. Gregory let out a strange, strangled gasp. He staggered backward, his hands flying to his chest. His fingers clawed at his silk tie, pulling it loose as his breathing became ragged. He collapsed backward into the heavy mahogany dining chair, his face instantly turning an alarming, sickly shade of gray. The patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist was now reduced to a trembling, hyperventilating shell. He stared at the ceiling, clutching his heart, completely paralyzed by the realization that his pristine reputation and his stolen retirement were vanishing simultaneously. Brittany slowly pushed herself off the ruined velvet wainscoting, her running mascara-streaked face twisting in absolute, entirely uncomprehending disbelief. "Jamal," she screamed, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "Where are you going? You cannot leave me here." Jamal crashed through the kitchen doors, oblivious to her cries. His flight was short-lived. 10 seconds later, he burst back through the doors, stumbling backward into the dining room. His eyes were wide with primal terror. He held his hands up his chest, heaving. Through the open kitchen doorway, the beams of heavy tactical flashlights pierced the darkness of the rear hallway. Federal agents had already secured the perimeter. They were stationed at the patio doors, the garage, and the service gate. There was absolutely no way out. The estate had become a perfectly sealed federal trap. Jamal backed away, whimpering under his breath, his eyes darting wildly around the room, as if hoping a secret passage would magically materialize. He bumped hard into the completely shattered cabinet and slid down to the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. The great visionary CEO was crying pathetically, completely shattered by the reality of his impending imprisonment. With Jamal trapped and Gregory incapacitated by his own failing heart, Patricia's survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She looked at the flashing lights, heard the heavy thud of a battering ram being positioned against the front doors, and finally looked at me. The venomous, demanding matriarch who had spent 30 years tearing down my self-esteem was gone. The woman who had proudly called my daughter a mistake just an hour ago was entirely replaced by a desperate, groveling stranger. Patricia practically crawled across the entire length of the ruined dining room floor. She ignored the jagged shards of crystal and the pools of spilled wine soaking into the knees of her expensive designer trousers. She reached me, her hands shaking violently as she reached out and grabbed the hem of my tailored trench coat. Her knuckles were white, her grip desperate, as if holding onto my coat could somehow shield her from the federal agents standing on her front porch. "Cassidy, please." Patricia begged, her voice a wet, sobbing gasp. Her carefully styled hair was plastered to her tear-soaked cheeks. "Please hide us. You have to help us. Tell them it is a huge mistake. You own the debt. You can call them off. You know people, Cassidy. You have power. Just tell them we had absolutely nothing to do with Jamal and his illegal business. We are your parents. We are your family. You are our daughter. Please do not let them take us away." She yanked on my coat, staring up at me with wide, pleading eyes. It was the ultimate display of her transactional nature. After a lifetime of treating me like an unwanted burden, after explicitly telling me I was unfit to sit at her Thanksgiving table, she was suddenly invoking the sacred bond of family to save her own skin. She expected the daughter she had relentlessly abused to throw herself in front of a federal raid. I looked down at the woman kneeling in the shattered glass. I felt absolutely no pity, no lingering filial obligation, and no desire to offer even a shred of comfort. My expression remained entirely cold, a perfect mirror of the icy indifference she had shown me my entire life. I reached down and methodically peeled her trembling fingers off the fabric of my coat, stepping back so she was forced to kneel unsupported in the wreckage of her own making. I stared directly into her desperate, tear-filled eyes. "You should not expect anything from a child like me, Mother," I said, my voice cutting through her sobs with absolute razor-sharp precision. "After all, you made it perfectly clear earlier tonight that I am an embarrassment. You explicitly told my daughter that she was a mistake who did not belong in this house. You chose this fraudulent lifestyle over us. You chose this fake wealth over your own flesh and blood. Now you get to deal with the consequences of your choices." A thunderous splintering crack echoed through the massive foyer, shaking the crystal chandelier above our heads. The heavy oak double doors blew open, the deadbolts ripping violently from the doorframe as the battering ram did its job. Jagged wood splintered and shattered, raining down onto the marble entryway. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents swarmed through the entrance, their tactical boots hitting the floor in perfect synchronization, their weapons raised and sweeping the room. Jamal laughed manically, lifting the back of his hand to wipe a fresh smear of blood from his split lip. The sound was raw, grating, and utterly devoid of reason, echoing off the high ceilings of the ruined dining room. He took a stumbling step forward, his chest heaving as he stared me down. "You actually think you have won, Cassidy?" He sneered, a desperate, dangerous light flickering in his eyes. "You think you can just waltz in here with your fancy paperwork and kick us out onto the street today? This is America. The legal system is incredibly slow. You cannot just bypass due process because you bought my corporate debt. It takes months, sometimes even years, to legally evict someone from a primary residence. I know the law, and I know my squatter's rights. We will live in this mansion, sleeping in our custom bed, and drinking whatever expensive wine is left in the cellar until the bank physically drags us out. I will tie this foreclosure up in so much litigation you will be begging to settle. I will file injunction after injunction. I will claim extreme financial hardship. I will bankrupt this entire process before I ever let you see me pack a single box." The sheer audacity of his claim hung in the heavy wine-scented air. He was a confessed fraudster, standing ankle-deep in shattered crystal, actively boasting about abusing the legal system to prolong his luxurious lifestyle. It was the absolute pinnacle of toxic entitlement. Brittany, who had been shrinking against the wainscoting just moments before, suddenly perked up. The reality of Jamal's words washed over her, reigniting that deeply ingrained superiority complex she had wielded against me since childhood. She quickly wiped her tears away with her hands, smearing her expensive mascara across her cheekbones in dark, jagged streaks. She stepped away from the wall, her posture straightening as she looked directly at me. A cruel, triumphant smirk broke through her ruined makeup. "He is right," Brittany said, her voice regaining its familiar condescending edge. "You cannot just throw us out. This is our home. My name is on the marital asset documents. We have tenant rights. We have residency established. We are not leaving. You can wave those federal documents around all you want, Cassidy, but you cannot touch us today. We are going to stay right here, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it." Patricia and Gregory exchanged a rapid, desperate glance. The prospect of squatting in a foreclosed mansion was humiliating, but it was infinitely better than being homeless. Their survival instinct latched onto Jamal's manic loophole. Patricia lifted her chin, attempting to salvage whatever shred of matriarchal dignity she could muster. "We will hire the best defense attorneys in the state," Patricia declared, her voice trembling but defiant. "We will countersue your firm for aggressive debt collection practices. We will tie this up in court for a decade if we have to. You may have the paperwork, Cassidy, but we have the physical house. We are not going anywhere." I listened to their unified chorus of delusion, completely unfazed. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply let them bask in their imaginary victory for a few precious seconds. I let them believe that they had found the ultimate escape hatch, that their manipulative tactics would save them one last time. They genuinely thought they had outsmarted me, relying on the very legal system Jamal had spent years defrauding. Their arrogance was blinding. They were so focused on squatters' rights and civil eviction laws that they completely ignored the magnitude of their actual crimes. Jamal paced the room, his torn suit jacket flapping, as he began listing the various legal motions he planned to file. He spoke of delaying tactics, sympathetic judges, and leveraging media connections to paint Vanguard Capital as a predatory lender. Brittany nodded along, already calculating how she could spin this victim narrative to her wealthy friends. Gregory breathed a sigh of relief, leaning back in his chair as the immediate threat of homelessness seemed to miraculously recede. Patricia actually managed a weak, condescending laugh, crossing her arms and looking at me as if I were a foolish child playing an adult game. They were all completely insulated by their privilege, utterly incapable of comprehending that the rules they had always played by no longer applied. I watched the Golden family rebuild their fragile fortress of denial layer by delusional layer. It was fascinating to witness how quickly they transitioned from sheer terror back to aggressive entitlement. With slow, deliberate precision, I raised my left arm and checked the face of my luxury watch. The steady ticking felt incredibly loud in the suddenly quiet room. I lowered my wrist and looked up, meeting Jamal's bloodshot eyes. A serene, calculated smile spread across my face. "You are absolutely right, Jamal," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "The eviction process in this state is notoriously slow. It requires formal notices, court dates, appeals, and endless bureaucratic red tape. It can take 6 to 8 months, sometimes longer, just to get a sheriff to execute a basic writ of possession." Jamal smirked, crossing his arms over his chest, clearly believing he had checkmated me. "See," he mocked, "you lose." My smile widened slightly. "Eviction takes months," I repeated, nodding in agreement. "Which is exactly why I never filed for eviction." The smug satisfaction vanished from Jamal's face, replaced by a sudden, creeping confusion. Brittany's smirk faltered. Gregory narrowed his eyes, sensing the trap closing around them. "What are you talking about?" Jamal demanded, his voice losing its confident edge. "If you did not file for eviction, you cannot force us out." I did not answer him directly. Instead, I simply pointed my right finger toward the large bay windows as flashing red and blue police lights suddenly reflected brightly across the shattered glass of the dark room. The front doors blew open, deadbolts ripping from the frame. Jagged wood splintered onto the marble. Armed federal agents swarmed the foyer, tactical boots hitting the floor and synchronization weapons raised. "Nobody move!" the lead agent roared. A squad in dark windbreakers emblazoned with yellow FBI lettering branched off, flooding the dining room. Jamal had no chance to run. 2 agents lunged, spinning him and slamming him face first against the custom silk wallpaper. The thud of his body echoed. "Jamal Harrison, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and embezzlement," the agent barked, pulling his arms back. The click of steel handcuffs ratcheting shut was beautiful. His manic arrogance vanished, replaced by the whimpering of a coward out of other people's money. Across the room, agents converged on Gregory. Slumped in his chair, clutching his chest, he was pale and sweating. An agent hauled him up, slapping cuffs onto his wrists. "Gregory Evans, you are under arrest for felony identity theft and fraud," the agent announced. Gregory did not fight. He sagged against the grip, a hollow man watching his legacy burn. Patricia watched the takedown in horror. She looked wildly between her husband and son-in-law, waiting for someone to throw money at the problem and make the bad men go away. But no one was left to save her. A female agent stepped over the ruined turkey, marching toward my mother. Patricia scrambled backward, hands slipping in the spilled wine. "Stand up," the agent commanded, hauling Patricia to her feet. "Get your hands off me," Patricia shrieked, entitlement resurfacing. "Do you know who I am? I demand your superior." "Patricia Evans, you are under arrest for felony identity theft," the agent stated. "You have the right to remain silent." The agent pulled Patricia's hands back. Heavy steel handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Patricia gasped, the physical restraints shattering her delusion. She was not a wealthy socialite being inconvenienced. She was a criminal apprehended for stealing her granddaughter's identity. The agents herded them toward the front door in a parade of absolute humiliation. The perfect family was marched out of their stolen mansion, stepping over the chaotic ruins of their Thanksgiving feast. Gregory stumbled head low. Jamal kept his face turned away. The agent guided Patricia past the dining table. Her designer clothes stained her face, a mask of unadulterated shame. As she was marched toward the foyer, a small figure emerged from the hallway. It was Mia. My daughter stood there in her simple holiday dress, holding her stuffed animal, her dark eyes taking in the scene with calm clarity. She walked out to see the people who had belittled her receiving justice. Mia looked at the agents, then her gaze locked onto Patricia's wrists bound tightly in cold steel. Slowly, Mia raised her hand and pointed toward the edge of the shattered dining table. Resting next to the toppled centerpiece, completely untouched by the carnage, was the cheap plastic pair of toy handcuffs Patricia had thrown at her earlier as a cruel joke. "See, Grandma," Mia said, her voice ringing out crystal clear. "I told you my present would come in handy." That single sentence was the killing blow, hitting Patricia harder than the federal indictment. The poetic justice of being mocked by the child she tried to ruin broke her completely. Patricia collapsed inwardly. Her legs gave out and she fell to her knees in the entryway, sobbing uncontrollably. The wails tearing from her throat were raw, ugly, and devoid of dignity. She wept in absolute disgrace, her fake empire demolished by her own greed. The agent hauled her back up, dragging her broken form out the front door and into the flashing lights of the waiting cruisers. The room felt incredibly empty. I stood near the dining table, feeling the weight of the past decade lifting from my shoulders. The toxic rot had been excised. A sudden movement caught my attention. Brittany was still here. The agents had ignored her. Because all stolen assets were in Jamal's name and the identity theft was solely executed by our parents, Brittany was the only adult not actively indicted. She was legally innocent, but utterly ruined. She stood alone in the devastated room. The mansion was being seized. Her husband was going to federal prison. Her parents were facing decades behind bars. The bank accounts were frozen. Her credit cards were dead plastic. She possessed nothing but the clothes on her back and the empty gift box. Brittany looked around wildly, the terrifying reality of sudden poverty crashing down on her. Her eyes finally landed on me. The realization that I was the only person left in the world with any power, money, or stability hit her like a freight train. She stumbled across the room, high heels crunching on broken plates. She fell to her knees in front of me. She reached out desperately, grabbing my hands, manicured fingers digging into my skin. "Cassidy, please!" Brittany wailed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Please, you have to help me. They took everything. Jamal is gone. Mom and Dad are gone. I have no money. I have nowhere to go. My friends will not take me in." She pressed her wet face against my hands, sobbing hysterically. "I am your sister. We are family. Please let me come live with you. I can help with Mia. I can clean. I will do anything. Just please do not leave me on the street. I have absolutely nothing left." I stood in the absolute center of the sudden deafening silence, feeling the winter draft from the broken front door wash completely over me. I looked down at the weeping, truly desperate woman currently clutching my hands. The golden child, the sister who delighted in my misery, who cheered as my parents stole my daughter's future, now begged on her knees to be my servant. I stared silently down at her, the ultimate choice of absolute final closure remaining. Brittany clung to my trench coat with desperate white-knuckled fingers. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the harsh glare of the federal flashlight sweeping across the dining room. She was hyperventilating, choking on her own tears, as she looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. The woman who had spent 30 years making sure I knew I was a second-class citizen in this family was now literally groveling at my feet. She expected me to default to my old role. She expected the scapegoat to fix her mistakes and sacrifice my own peace to shelter her from the cold reality of absolute ruin. I felt Mia shift slightly beside me, her small hand gripping mine with quiet strength. I looked at my daughter's resilient dark eyes, then back down at the weeping shell of my sister. I did not feel a shred of pity. I did not feel any lingering obligation to the concept of sisterhood. That bond had been severed long ago by her own relentless cruelty. I detached Brittany's trembling fingers from my coat, stepping back so she was forced to kneel unsupported in the spilled wine. Brittany gasped, reaching out again, but I held up a single hand to stop her. "You called me worthless just 2 hours ago, Brittany," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden quiet of the secured room. "You explicitly told me that I did not belong here, that my daughter was a mistake, and that my life was an embarrassment to your pristine image. I am simply respecting your boundaries. I am protecting you from catching my failure lifestyle. You chose this fraudulent empire. You chose to blindly spend stolen money while mocking the person who actually worked for a living. Now the bill has come due, and I am not paying it for you. Have a nice life." Brittany let out a strangled wail, collapsing onto the ruined rug. Her shoulders shook violently as the absolute finality of my words crushed her remaining delusions. She was entirely alone. I turned my back on her and did not look back. I squeezed Mia's hand gently, offering a small smile. "Let us go home, sweetheart," I said softly. Mia nodded, her expression perfectly serene. Together, we walked away from the shattered table, stepping over the debris of the ruined feast. We moved slowly through the grand foyer, navigating around the splintered oak front doors and the heavily armed federal agents methodically cataloging seized assets. The chandelier above flickered, casting long, fractured shadows across the marble floor. The house that had always felt like a suffocating museum of fake wealth and toxic expectations was now nothing more than a highly active crime scene. The agents stepped aside, parting seamlessly to let us pass. They offered respectful nods, acknowledging our absolute separation from the criminal enterprise they were dismantling. We stepped over the threshold, leaving the oppressive wine-soaked air of the mansion behind us forever. The biting chill of the November night hit us immediately, acting as a sharp, cleansing contrast to the stifling heat of the raided dining room. We stood on the expansive stone porch, taking in the picturesque cinematic American winter scene unfolding around us. A gentle, pristine snow had begun to fall, the large white flakes drifting down from the dark sky to blanket the manicured lawns and the paved circular driveway. The snow caught the erratic flashes of the red and blue police lights, creating a mesmerizing, almost peaceful visual effect. Idling silently at the base of the stone steps was a sleek, perfectly polished black SUV. The vehicle stood out in stark contrast to the chaotic cluster of federal cruisers and tactical vans securing the perimeter. My private chauffeur Marcus stood attentively beside the open rear passenger door. He wore a crisp dark suit and a calm professional expression, completely unbothered by the federal raid happening just yards away. He held a large black umbrella aloft to shield us from the falling snow as we descended the steps. "Good evening, Ms. Wilson," Marcus said smoothly, offering a polite bow of his head. "Your vehicle is ready for the return trip to Manhattan." "Thank you, Marcus," I replied, helping Mia slide into the warm, luxurious leather interior before climbing in beside her. The heavy door closed with a solid, comforting thud, instantly muting the chaotic noise of the estate. I sank back into the heated leather seat, pulling Mia close to my side. She rested her head against my shoulder, letting out a long, contented sigh. I slowly turned my gaze toward the heavily tinted window, watching the final act of my family's self-destruction play out on the snowy driveway. Several federal agents emerged from the splintered front doors, forcefully escorting Patricia Gregory and Jamal down the steps. Patricia was still weeping hysterically, her designer clothes stained and disheveled, her head bowed in absolute disgrace as the cold snow fell on her ruined hair. Gregory stumbled blindly, a hollow, broken patriarch being shoved toward a waiting transport van. Jamal followed closely behind, his arrogant swagger entirely replaced by the trembling shuffle of a defeated criminal. They were aggressively patted down and shoved into the back of the federal cruisers, the heavy metal doors slamming shut behind them to seal their fate. The nightmare was officially over. The toxic chains that had bound me to their fraudulent expectations were permanently severed. I had reclaimed my dignity, secured my daughter's future, and established absolute financial dominance. Marcus smoothly shifted the SUV into gear, and the powerful engine hummed to life. The vehicle glided away from the seized mansion, its tires crunching softly against the fresh snow. We drove past the federal barricades and turned onto the dark, winding road leading back toward the city. I wrapped my arm tightly around Mia, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of peace wash over my entire soul. We were driving back to Manhattan fully victorious, completely untouchable, and finally free.